Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the foundations, the very DNA of Western theology.
That's right. We're using James Michael's Christian Thought, the Evolution of Western Theology, as our map.
And it's more than just history, isn't it? It's about understanding how these ideas shaped, well, almost everything around us in the West.
Exactly. Ethics, art, politics. Its influence is huge. So this deep dive aims to give you a clear path through this vast landscape, hitting the key milestones.
Right. And the book gives us a great framework, 5 main periods. First, the beginnings, from the Bible to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. That's roughly the 1st to 5th centuries.
Then we jump into the Middle Ages, which is a big one, 6th to 15th centuries.
Followed by the huge shifts of the Reformation in the 16th century.
Then post-Reformation developments taking us from the 17th right up to the 19th century.
And finally, bringing us up to speed with contemporary Christian thought, the 20th and 21st centuries.
Our goal here is really to pull out the crucial bits, the ideas that really made a difference, so you get a solid grasp without getting totally bogged down in detail.
Okay, so let's dive in. Part 1. From the Bible to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. This is the origin story.
Yeah, where it all starts. We need to talk about the key figures first. You've got Peter, obviously, a core disciple, leader, eventually martyr.
And Paul.
Yeah.
You can't overstate Paul's influence, can you? His writings on justification by faith, grace, his whole understanding of Christ, it's foundational.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is how they each add a different flavor. John, for instance, introduces this concept of the Logos Christ as the divine word. It's quite philosophical.
Right, linking Christ to the very creation, the reason of God.
Exactly. And then James brings in that practical angle, emphasizing that faith without works, without ethical action, isn't really genuine faith. It's a needed balance.
So it's these figures, but also the context. Christianity spreads pretty rapidly after Jesus' death and resurrection, right? Apostles traveling, especially Paul.
His journeys were remarkable. And crucially, this is when the Gospels are being written down. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, different perspectives on Jesus, plus Paul's letters. These texts become the bedrock.
But it wasn't easy going at first.
Not at all. You have to remember, early Christianity was this tiny, often suspect group within the huge Roman Empire and actively persecuted at times.
Yeah, emperors like Nero, the great fire of Rome blame, and Diocletian later on, much more systematic persecution.
Because they saw it as a threat, didn't they? A threat to Roman gods, Roman traditions, even the emperor's own authority, a different loyalty.
Yet it kept spreading. Why do you think that was, despite the danger?
Well, it seemed to offer something powerful, especially to those on the margins, the poor, slaves, women, a message of hope, salvation, community, things that Roman society didn't always provide.
Okay, and then comes a massive shift. Emperor Constantine, early 4th century.
Yeah, this is a real game changer. His conversion, or at least his favor towards Christianity, and then the Edict of Milan in 313.
Which basically legalized it, stopped the official persecution.
Exactly. It went from being hunted to being, well, permissible, and then increasingly favored. Constantine's support was huge.
And that leads pretty directly to the First Council of Nicaea in 325.
Right. Constantine himself convened it. The church was facing this major internal debate about the nature of Christ's divinity. Was he fully God, created? Nicaea was called to sort that out.
To establish a kind of official line on these core beliefs, like the Trinity.
Precisely, solidifying doctrine. And that process of formalization continued after Nicaea.
So theology gets more developed, church structures become more defined, more hierarchical.
Yes, and you also see the rise of something really significant. Monasticism. Figures like St. Benedict establishing communities that would become incredibly important later on.
For learning, preserving knowledge.
And much more. But also, bishops and theologians start playing bigger roles, not just in the church, but in sort of political life too, as the empire itself weakened.
Which brings us to the 5th century. Barbarian invasions, the Western Roman Empire crumbling.
Yeah.
Sounds like chaos.
It was definitely tumultuous. But oddly enough, the church emerged as a point of stability.
How so?
Well, as Roman political authority collapsed, the church structures often remained. Bishops sometimes took on leadership roles. They preserved learning, some sense of order.
So when the Western Empire officially falls in 476, the church is kind of positioned to step into the void.
In many ways, yes, especially in the West. It laid the groundwork for the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, to gain not just spiritual, but increasing political influence in the centuries to come.
Okay, so that takes us from these biblical roots through persecution to becoming a major institutional force. Let's move into that next huge era, the Middle Ages.
Right, the Middle Ages. roughly 6th to the 15th century. And here, the church isn't just a force, it's arguably the central stabilizing force across much of fragmented Europe.
After Rome's collapse, it provided continuity.
Exactly. And monasticism, which we touched on, really comes into its own here. Benedictine orders and others, they weren't just places of prayer.
No, you mentioned learning, but there were much more, weren't they?
Oh, hugely. Centers of education, preserving ancient manuscripts, developing agriculture, providing charity, acting as cultural hubs, really vital infrastructure for medieval society.
And alongside the monasteries, you have the rise of the papacy. The Pope's power grows significantly.
Definitely. It's a long, complex story involving theological arguments like the Pope being Peter's successor, political maneuvering alliances.
It wasn't always smooth sailing, though. I seem to recall struggles with kings and emperors.
Oh, constantly. The relationship between church and state, popes and monarchs was often incredibly tense. Who had the ultimate authority? That leads to things like the investiture controversy.
Right, the fight over who gets to appoint bishops and other church officials.
Exactly. A major power struggle in the 11th and 12th centuries, which ultimately tended to strengthen the Pope's hand, at least for a while.
Intellectually, this period is famous for scholasticism. Sounds very academic. What was the core idea?
Well, the big project was trying to synthesize Christian faith with classical philosophy, especially Aristotle's logic and methods, using reason to explore and explain faith.
Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas.
He's the giant, yes. His Summa Theologica is a landmark. Scholasticism dug deep into salvation, God's nature, the church's role. Really sophisticated stuff. And universities often grew up around cathedrals and was centers for this kind of thinking.
But the church itself wasn't monolithic during this time. There were major splits.
True. The biggest, undoubtedly, is in a great schism around 1054.
A split between East and West, Orthodox and Catholic.
Precisely. Deep-seated differences in theology, practice, culture, and politics finally led to a formal, lasting break. And then you have the Crusades.
Aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land.
That was the stated goal, yes. But they were complex, often brutal campaigns with huge political and economic dimensions, and they definitely created lasting bitterness between Christians, Muslims, and Jews.
Within Western Christianity itself, though, there were also new movements emerging, things like the Franciscans.
Yes. Powerful movements focused on reform, piety, and service. The Franciscans, founded by St. Francis of Assisi, emphasized poverty, humility, preaching to ordinary people. The Dominicans, founded by St. Dominic, focused on preaching and combating heresy.
So a real desire for a more personal, perhaps less institutional faith.
You see that strongly, yes. And also a growth in mysticism, figures like St. Catherine of Siena, seeking a direct, intense personal experience of God.
But towards the end of the Middle Ages, say the 14th, 15th centuries, criticisms of the church seemed to mount.
They really do. Several things fuel this. The Avignon papacy, where popes lived in France under French influence.
The Babylonian captivity of the papists.
And then the Great Schism of the West, where you actually had two, sometimes even three, rival popes. This badly damaged the church's prestige.
Plus ongoing concerns about wealth, corruption.
Exactly. Clerical abuses, the selling of church offices, simony, these were widespread criticisms.
And this context gives rise to figures like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia, forerunners of the Reformation.
Absolutely key figures. They challenged papal authority, criticized corruption, advocated for translating the Bible into everyday languages. Wycliffe did oversee an English translation. Huss questioned indulgences.
Ideas that would get them into deep trouble, obviously. Huss was executed.
Yes. But their ideas didn't die, they planted seeds. And another major event around this time is the fall of Constantinople in 1453.
To the Ottoman Turks. A huge blow to Eastern Christianity.
A massive shock. End of the Byzantine Empire. But it also had an unexpected consequence for the West.
Which was?
Greek scholars fled westward, mainly to Italy, bringing classical texts and knowledge with them. This gave a real boost to the Renaissance, which was already underway.
Interesting. So that influx of classical learning also feeds into the intellectual ferment that challenges medieval ways of thinking.
It's all interconnected. The Renaissance, the criticisms of the church, the earlier reform movements, it all sets the stage.
So the Middle Ages, far from being static, were incredibly dynamic, shaping Europe and leading right up to this massive rupture of the Reformation.
Exactly. The 16th century, a period of profound upheaval, theological, political, cultural. It fundamentally changed the religious map of Europe.
And it really kicks off, or at least crystallizes, with Martin Luther and his 95 Theses in 1517. What was his main beef initially?
The trigger was the sale of indulgences. Luther saw it as a corrupt practice, basically selling salvation or at least relief from punishment for sin, but his critique quickly went much, much deeper.
Right. It wasn't just about indulgences.
No. He developed these core theological principles. Solidified salvation comes through faith alone, a gift from God, not earned by good works. Sola Scriptura, the Bible alone, is the ultimate authority, not church tradition or the Pope. And the priesthood of all believers, every Christian has direct access to God.
Which directly challenged the entire structure and authority of the Catholic Church at the time.
Absolutely, it struck at the very root.
And Luther's ideas spread like wildfire, thanks in part to the printing press.
The printing press was crucial. It allowed his writings and the ensuing debates to circulate incredibly quickly and widely. But it wasn't just Luther. Other reformers emerged.
Like Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland.
Yes, Zwingli in Zurich. And perhaps even more influential in the long run, John Calvin in Geneva.
Calvin's theology, Calvinism, becomes hugely significant.
Hugely. His ideas about God's sovereignty, predestination, his systematic approach, they shaped Reformed churches across Switzerland, France, the Netherlands, Scotland, and later in America.
And then there's the English Reformation, which had its own unique path.
A bit different, yes. Initially driven more by Henry VIII's political desire for an annulment, but it eventually led to the Church of England separating from Rome and developing its own theological identity, albeit one that retained some Catholic structures.
So you end up with Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, and other groups like the Anabaptists, a real splintering. How did the Catholic Church respond?
Well, initially with condemnation, Luther was excommunicated, but they also realized they needed internal reform. This leads to the Counter-Reformation, or Catholic Reformation.
Centered around the Council of Trent.
Yes, the Council of Trent, meeting over many years, was key. It reaffirmed traditional Catholic doctrines challenged by Protestants, but also initiated serious reforms, clamping down on corruption, improving clergy education, promoting new religious orders.
Like the Jesuits.
Exactly. The Society of Jesus became incredibly important for education, missionary work, and defending Catholicism intellectually.
But all this theological disagreement didn't stay purely academic, did it? It led to actual conflict.
Oh, terribly so. The 16th and early 17th centuries saw devastating religious wars across Europe, France, the Holy Roman Empire, intense conflict between Catholic and Protestant forces.
There was an attempt to settle things with the Peace of Augsburg in 1555.
Yes, based on the principle cuius regio, ius's religio, the ruler's religion, determines the territory's religion. But it only recognized Catholicism and Lutheranism, and it was fragile.
Ultimately leading to the 30 Years' War in the next century.
In many ways, yes. That war, from 1618 to 1648, was catastrophic, fueled by these deep religious and political divisions.
Beyond the wars, what were the broader cultural impacts of the Reformation?
Massive. The emphasis on scripture spurred literacy. The questioning of religious authority bled into questioning political authority. It fostered individualism, different ways of thinking about community and the state. It really reshaped Western culture.
So the Reformation shatters medieval unity, creates religious diversity, fuels conflict, but also sparks cultural change, leading into the post-Reformation era.
Precisely. And that period, 17th to 19th centuries, sees the consequences play out alongside new intellectual challenges. The religious wars continued, as we mentioned, with the 30 Years' War ending in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia.
Which is seen as a landmark treaty, right? Establishing ideas of state sovereignty.
Yes, and formally recognizing Calvinism alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism within the Holy Roman Empire. It marked a shift towards a more secular political order, though religion remained hugely important.
England, meanwhile, had its own turmoil, the Civil War.
Deeply tied to religion. Puritans versus the established Anglican Church and the monarchy. That led to Cromwell's Puritan Commonwealth.
Which didn't last.
No, the monarchy was restored, bringing back Anglican dominance and persecution of dissenters. Then the Glorious Revolution of 1688 confirmed Protestant rule, but also brought the Toleration Act of 1689.
Offering some limited tolerance for non-Anglican Protestants.
Limited, yes, but a step. But alongside all this religious conflict and shifting politics, you have the rise of the Enlightenment.
The Age of Reason, a major challenge to traditional faith.
A profound challenge. Thinkers like Voltaire, Locke, Hume emphasized reason, observation, individual rights over tradition and revelation. They questioned miracles, the Bible's literal truth.
Deism becomes popular among some intellectuals. Belief in a creator God who doesn't intervene.
Exactly. It seemed more rational to many. But it's important to remember this wasn't the only story. There were powerful religious revivals happening too.
Like the Great Awakening in America.
Yes, passionate preaching, focus on personal conversion, emotional experiences. It reshaped American religion and arguably fed into the revolutionary spirit's emphasis on individual liberty.
Yeah, and in England, you had John Wesley and Methodism.
Right. Wesley emphasized personal faith, holy living, social action, reaching out to the working classes who often felt left out by the established church. A very different feel from Enlightenment rationalism.
So moving into the 19th century, Christianity is dealing with the legacy of the Reformation, the Enlightenment, these revivals, plus industrialization, new science.
It's a complex mix. You see attempts to adapt. Modernist theology emerges, trying to reconcile faith with historical criticism of the Bible, with science. Figures like Schleiermacher, this leads to liberal Protestantism.
Which tended to focus more on ethics and experience than traditional dogma.
Often, yes, but there was pushback. The Catholic Church, feeling besieged by secularism and rationalism, reacted strongly at the First Vatican Council.
That's where papal infallibility was formally defined.
Yes, in 1870, a strong assertion of papal authority against modern trends. And another huge aspect of the 19th century was global expansion.
The Great Missionary Age.
Unprecedented missionary activity, spreading Christianity across Africa, Asia, the Americas, often linked, unfortunately, with colonialism, leading to complex cultural encounters and consequences.
So, by the end of the 19th century, Christianity is global, diverse, but also facing serious intellectual challenges from science, like Darwinism and the rise of nationalism, setting the stage for the 20th century.
Absolutely. Which brings us to our final period, contemporary Christian thought, the 20th and 21st centuries. And things certainly don't slow down.
Modernism continues to be a force early on, reconciling faith with science, philosophy.
Yes, and you see new movements like Christian Science or New Thought emerging, alongside ongoing debates spurred by biblical criticism and new Bible translations. But then comes the massive trauma of the two world wars.
That must have had a profound impact on theology. All that suffering, the Holocaust.
It forced a reckoning. How to understand evil on that scale. Where was God? Thinkers like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, writing from a Nazi prison, developed a theology of resistance, of religionless Christianity, focused on ethical action in the world.
And elsewhere, like in Latin America, you get liberation theology.
Exactly, reading the Bible through the lens of the poor and oppressed, advocating for social justice, challenging political and economic structures, a very different emphasis.
Within the Catholic Church, the big event is Vatican II in the 1960s.
Huge, a real opening up. More dialogue with other Christians and faiths, liturgical reforms, Mass in everyday language, not just Latin, a greater emphasis on the Bible. It transformed Catholicism.
At roughly the same time, you see a resurgence of evangelicalism, particularly in the U.S.
Yes, a powerful resurgence. New methods of evangelism, often using media, a strong focus on personal conversion, biblical authority, and increasingly political influence.
And then, more recently, the influence of postmodern thought, questioning big narratives, objective truth.
That's added another layer of complexity. It's led to more focus on context, diversity, different perspectives within theology, integration with feminism, post-colonial theory, environmental ethics.
And maybe a renewed interest in older practices, like contemplative prayer.
Definitely. A turn towards experience and practice alongside doctrine. But alongside these diversifications, there's also been a push for unity.
Ecumenism, trying to bridge the gaps between denominations.
Right. Lots of dialogue, collaboration, trying to heal those historical divisions we talked about.
But challenges remain. Secularization in the West.
Yes, a major trend in Europe and North America. Yet at the same time, Christianity is growing rapidly in the global South Africa, Asia, Latin America. The center of gravity is shifting.
And ongoing debates about ethics, sexuality, gender, the environment.
Absolutely. Plus tensions between more liberal and conservative wings, the rise of fundamentalism in response to modernity. The conversation is very much alive and often contentious.
What an incredible journey. From this small group following Jesus, through empires, schisms, reformations, revolutions, world wars, it's just remarkable how Christian thought has constantly evolved and adapted.
It really is. The sources we've touched on show this ongoing dialogue, this tension between holding on to tradition and responding to completely new questions and contexts. It's never been static.
Never. Always interacting with the culture around it, shaping it and being shaped by it.
That interplay is key between the core beliefs and the changing world.
So after tracing this immense history, this evolution across 2 millennia, it really makes you wonder, What do you see as the biggest challenges, or maybe the most interesting opportunities, facing Christian thought as we continue deeper into the 21st century? How will it keep navigating this complex modern world?